John MacRae secured a room for himself at a boarding house just off of the main street. He was hungry and had a large beefsteak for dinner. After dinner, John MacRae picked up a day-old edition of the Black Hills Weekly Times, along with a bottle of whiskey. The newspaper had an article in it about the capture and trial of John Eagleton. John MacRae went back to his room at the boarding house. It was cold in the room, and he wrapped a blanket around himself. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, lit a cigar, and started to carefully read the article. John MacRae was restless and could not get the day's events out of his mind. The whiskey and cigar had a calming effect on him. The article was about the trial. John MacRae could not sleep, and he had 3 more glasses of whiskey as he pondered over the article. He thought of his old commanding officer at Fort Keele, and he wondered if he was Jacob Stone's father. John MacRae awoke early with a throbbing headache. He ate a light breakfast with lots of coffee and then walked over to the jail. The jailer had become greedy and told John MacRae that each visit would cost him a $50 gold piece. John MacRae shook his head and said, "I'll give you what you want, but I'll need more than 5 minutes of visit." The jailer nodded, and John MacRae reached in his pocket. He gave the jailer a stern look and then tossed him a $50 gold piece. John MacRae followed the jailer down into the cell area. The jailer again pointed at the yellow line and said, "Don't go beyond that yellow line or I'll have to throw you out of here." John MacRae grabbed a chair, sat down behind the yellow line and said, "I read an account of the trial in the local newspaper. Why don't you tell me your story?" The jailer had dozed off to sleep in his chair, and White Eagle put his hand through the bar and said quietly, "He's asleep. Quick, give me your knife." "You know I can't do that. Just tell me what happened," said John MacRae. White Eagle sat down on the pallet in his cell and said, "The Stone Ranch owes me a lot of money. I ran into Jacob Stone at the livery stable several weeks ago and asked him when he was going to settle his account. He told me to go to hell and that he'd be damned if he'd pay anything to an Indian. He was angry because he found out that his wife made a pass at me a while back. I went out to the Stone Ranch to see if I could reason with the old man. When I arrived at the ranch, Mary Stone came out to greet me. She said her father-in-law was in town and her husband was out checking stock. I told her I'd come back tomorrow and started to leave. Mary asked me if I would take a look at a newborn colt that was not doing well. I didn't think that was a good idea, and I told her so. She pleaded with me and said, "I just want you to look at a newborn colt." I finally agreed, which was a big mistake. We went into the barn. There was no colt. She closed the door and walked up to me. She put her arms around me and started kissing me. I pushed her away and I told her I needed to leave. She started crying and she said, "You don't know what it's like being married to a man like Jacob Stone. He's got a terrible temper and he beats me for nothing." I told her I was sorry to hear that and left. "Is that what you testified to in court?" said John MacRae. White Eagle clasped his hands together and said, "Yes, that's pretty much it, word for word. When I told that story in court, there was so much noise from the crowd that I'm sure the jury didn't hear a word of what I said." "Tell me about the pass his wife made at you," said John MacRae. White Eagle stood up and said, "Mary was in my store one day. She thought we were alone. She kissed me and started to complain about Jacob. One of Stone's ranch hands was in the store at the same time, and he must have seen it." John MacRae put his hand on his chin and said, "What did you do?" "I pushed her away. I'm not stupid. Besides, I wanted nothing to do with her or any of the Stones," said White Eagle. John MacRae stood up and said, "It's time I paid the Stones a visit." White Eagle put his hand through the bars again and said, "He is still sleeping. Give me your knife." John MacRae did not answer White Eagle. He walked over to the jailer and woke him up and said, "I'm leaving. I'll be back tomorrow." White Eagle shouted, "I told you what happened. No one believes anything I say. It's hopeless. I don't want to die by a rope." The jailer said, "Bring another $50 gold piece." John MacRae awoke early again. He ate a big breakfast and then asked for directions to the Stones Ranch. He was told that the Stones Ranch was 4 miles east of Deadwood on the road to Sturgis. He saddled up Mac and left Deadwood for the Stones Ranch. The ride was uneventful as the terrain soon flattened out after leaving Deadwood. When John MacRae arrived at the Stones Ranch, he was surprised how big it was. He rode through an open iron gate up to a large stone and framed 2-story building that he speculated was the main dwelling. As he was tying Mac's reins to the hitching post, he heard a familiar voice. His old commanding officer, George Stone, was walking towards him and said, "I heard you were in town. I was wondering when you would be out here. You might as well get back on that horse because this will be a very brief conversation, MacRae." John MacRae looked at George Stone and said, "So it really is you. I heard you were killed on duty somewhere. I just want to ask you a few questions about John Eagleton." "I'm not dead, MacRae, and I'm not answering any damn questions. I'm warning you to mind your own damn business. That bastard is going to hang. Now you get your Indian-loving ass on that horse and get off of my property," said George Stone as he shook his finger at John MacRae. "I suppose talking to your son is out of the question," said John MacRae. "You son of a bitch, get the hell off my property or else," shouted George Stone. John MacRae walked over to George Stone, looked him in the eye and said, "Are you threatening me?" Just then, John MacRae heard the levering of a Winchester behind his back. He turned around and faced a tall, thin man with short blonde hair and a bald spot in back. The man had sharp, angular features and a nervous demeanor about him. It was Jacob Stone. "What's all the shouting about, Father?" said Jacob Stone. "This is the Indian-loving son of a bitch that I told you about," said George Stone. John MacRae mounted his horse and said, "This isn't over yet." Jacob Stone pointed his finger at John MacRae and said, "It will be over for you damn quickly if you don't back off." John MacRae turned Mac towards the iron gate and rode off without saying another word. He pondered over his conversation with George Stone and thought that if White Eagle was truly guilty, why such an overreaction from the father? Why the veiled threat from Jacob Stone? John MacRae started to wonder that if he would be able to help White Eagle at all. He could still not believe that White Eagle could commit such an act. John MacRae returned to Deadwood and started inquiring about the Stones. He was surprised how much power and influence George Stone seemed to hold in Deadwood. Nobody would give him any information or discuss anything about the Stones. In fact, John MacRae was told by several people to stop interfering in this matter for his own good. John MacRae went to visit White Eagle. He gave another $50 gold piece to the jailer. The greedy jailer smiled. John MacRae wondered what the city fathers would think of the jailer's greed. John MacRae told White Eagle of his meeting with the Stones. White Eagle could sense frustration in John MacRae's voice. White Eagle again put his hand through the bars and said, "You can see that this is all hopeless. I've only got 2 days left. They may not let you in here anymore, so please give me your knife." John MacRae ignored White Eagle's request and said, "Can you think of anyone in Deadwood who is not afraid of George Stone? Or better yet, tell me why everyone is so afraid of him. Think. You need to give me some sort of an answer here." White Eagle said, "I've heard that George Stone is the majority stockholder in one of the biggest banks in Deadwood. He is said to control who is able to borrow money. I have also heard that he has had dealings with Al Swearingen. It's also common knowledge that if you cross him in any way, he will have your loans recalled. I don't know how much truth there is to that. It's only what I've heard. I had cash money to buy my store without any loans. I've heard that George Stone was unhappy about that, but I've never had any difficulties with him until he stopped paying on his account. Why do you think the Stones stopped paying you? Said John MacRae. White Eagle said, I'm sure it started when Jacob Stone found out about the pass his wife made at me. Think carefully. Is there anyone else who has had bad dealings with either the Stones and might be willing to talk about it? Said John MacRae. I can't think of anyone. Well, wait. There was this whore who had an affair with Jacob Stone a few years ago. It got pretty ugly. She almost killed young Stone. But I don't think she will talk to you, said White Eagle. What's the name of that whore and where can I find her? Said John MacRae. Her name is Molly, but everyone calls her the Duchess. She lives in a little shack about 2 miles east of town. In fact, it's on the way out to the Stones ranch. She stopped whoring after the incident with Jacob Stone. I heard she used to be a seamstress back east, and she takes in sewing and repairs leather items. She has a sharp tongue, said White Eagle. John MacRae said, I'll be paying her a visit. I'll see you tomorrow. I don't know what good that will do. I don't have much time left. I don't want to die by the rope, said White Eagle as he stood up and raised his hands towards John MacRae. You won't, said John MacRae as he followed the jailer out of the cell area. John MacRae awoke early. He skipped breakfast and just had some coffee. He walked over to the livery stable. He saddled Mac and headed for Molly's shack. There were snow flurries in the air. As John MacRae arrived at Molly's shack, the snow flurries had turned into large flakes and were starting to accumulate on the ground. Molly's shack was in a wooded area near a small bluff. It was a log cabin that was well kept. He would not have called it a shack. A thin wisp of gray smoke was rising out of a stone chimney. John MacRae dismounted Mac and was about to tie the reins to a small birch tree when the cabin doors opened. He heard the cocking of 2 shotgun hammers. Molly stepped out. She pointed a shotgun at John MacRae and said, What the hell do you want? John MacRae raised his hand above his shoulders and said, I just want to ask you a few questions, ma'am. I'm a friend of White Eagle's. I heard of you. I got nothing to say to you. You better get the hell out of here for your own good, said Molly, as she lowered the barrel of the shotgun slightly. John MacRae studied the woman. Molly was wearing a man's shirt that hung down almost to her knees. Her legs were bare and she was barefoot. Molly was much younger than John MacRae had imagined she would be. Underneath her harsh appearance was an attractive woman with flashing blue eyes. The falling snow seemed to stick to her long, raven black hair. John MacRae was about to speak when a rifle shot rang out. The shot came from the top of a small bluff near the cabin. The shot hit John MacRae in the left shoulder. A second shot rang out and grazed John MacRae's head, knocking his hat off. John MacRae collapsed in front of the cabin. Molly raised the shotgun towards the bluff and fired both barrels. She opened the shotgun, reached in her pocket, pulled out 2 shells, and reloaded the shotgun. She was about to fire again when she heard the sound of a horse galloping away. She looked at John MacRae and thought he was dead. When he moved slightly, Molly leaned the shotgun against the tree and said, Shit. She dragged John MacRae inside her cabin and closed the door. When John MacRae awoke, he was laying in Molly's bed. A piece of white bedsheet was folded and tied around his forehead. His shoulder throbbed from the wound. Molly handed John MacRae a tin cup with water in it. He took a long drink, handed the cup back to her and said thanks. Molly sat down by the bed and said, "You were damn lucky. Jacob is a pretty good shot. I'm surprised he missed you. Jacob's father stopped by yesterday and he told me about you. He warned me not to talk to you or Jacob would take care of the both of us. I didn't think you would come out here, and I didn't think Jacob was serious. I guess I was wrong." "How do you know it was Jacob?" said John MacRae. "Oh, it was Jacob, all right. The old man's eyesight is pretty bad. Here, take a swig of this," said Molly as she handed John MacRae a bottle of whiskey. John MacRae took 2 swigs and said, "Can you tell me anything about the Stones? I'm certain that White Eagle is innocent." Molly took the bottle of whiskey back from John MacRae. She took a swig and said, "Jacob has a real nasty temper, especially when he drinks. We were together off and on for about a year whenever he got bored with his wife. He is used to getting everything his own way. I don't bow to any man, and one day he really lost his temper." Molly unbuttoned her shirt and opened it up. Above her breasts and on her shoulders were scars from stab wounds. "Look what he did to me. The son of a bitch stabbed me 7 times. He would have killed me if I didn't have my Derringer handy. I shot him in the leg, and I told him I'd kill him if I ever saw him again. I'm not the only whore he ever stabbed. His old man covered up every bad deed Jacob did. If it weren't for the old man, Jacob himself might have been hung a few times. After that, I gave up whoring. I'm trying to save up enough money to go back east," said Molly, taking another swig of whiskey and then buttoning her shirt back up. John MacRae looked at his pocket watch and said, "It sounds like I need to visit the Stones again. I better get out of here. White Eagle is scheduled to hang tomorrow at noon." "I'm not sure you can do anything for him now," said Molly. John MacRae said, "I'm going back over to the Stones ranch." Molly frowned and said, "You ain't going anywhere, MacRae. You don't want that shoulder to start bleeding again." "I'll be okay. I just can't lay here. Time is running out for White Eagle. He hangs tomorrow at noon," said John MacRae. "Why are you so eager to save White Eagle?" said Molly. "He saved my life many years ago," said John MacRae. "Why don't you wait till after sundown? I'll go with you out to the Stones ranch. Jacob usually gets drunk after supper and passes out." "Say, you got a wife back home, Mr. MacRae?" said Molly. John MacRae was taken aback by the question and said, "Never been married. Why do you ask?" Molly smiled and said, "Just nosy, I guess. Let me make you something to eat, and then we'll go over to the Stones after dark." "All right," said John MacRae, as he leaned back against a pillow. Molly cooked John MacRae a beefsteak. She spruced herself up while he was eating. Molly brushed her long black hair and put on a red blouse, along with a pair of riding trousers. John MacRae found himself studying Molly. She noticed his occasional glances and smiled slightly. John MacRae finally said, "You are a fine-looking woman. How did you end up in Deadwood?" "I'm sure you heard stories like this before. I came out here from Ohio with my parents when I was 18. My father was going to work at the gold mine as the paymaster. My mother had a dress store back home. They both died from typhus, and I was left alone out here. I don't think I need to tell you the rest," said Molly, as she stared down at the bare wood floor. John MacRae said, "That's why I came to Deadwood, to be the paymaster at the gold mine." Tears welled up in her eyes, and Molly said, "My father was a decent, hard-working man. I'm glad he never got to see what a miserable wretch I turned out to be. Since you know so much about me, tell me why you never got married." John MacRae smiled and said, "I haven't found a woman yet who could cook good enough to suit my taste." The steak is mighty tasty." Molly looked at John MacRae with a puzzled look, then loaded her Derringer. She said, "I better take this with me." Molly and John MacRae waited until darkness set in, then left for the Stones ranch. There was a chill in the air, and Molly wore an old man's Mackinaw coat. She put her derringer inside one of the upper side pockets. There was almost a full moon, and they took their time with Molly in the lead. They arrived at the Stones Ranch. John MacRae and Molly dismounted and tied their horses. John MacRae took the lead as they slowly and quietly approached the main building. John MacRae cautiously looked through a window and whispered to Molly, "I only see Old Man Stone in here. Where do you think Jacob is?" Molly whispered back, "I'm sure he is drunk and passed out by now." She would soon regret making that assumption. John MacRae slowly turned the doorknob on the front door. The door appeared to be unlocked. He opened the door quietly, walked through the foyer, and entered a large parlor. George Stone was dozing in a large brown leather chair. A half-filled bottle of whiskey was on a table next to the chair. John MacRae approached George Stone. He levered his Winchester and pointed it at him. The levering of the Winchester woke George Stone up. He had a startled and frightened look on his face. He started to speak, but John MacRae interrupted George Stone and said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to ask you some questions, and I want straight answers. None of your damn bullshit." This was the first time Molly heard John MacRae use coarse language, and she said, "Oh my." "Where is your son?" said John MacRae. "Right behind you. Drop that rifle now," said Jacob Stone as he stepped out from a doorway and cocked his Winchester. John MacRae realized that Jacob Stone had him covered and dropped the rifle. Molly reached into Mackinaw's pocket and pulled out her derringer, but Jacob Stone was too quick for her. He fired one round, hitting Molly in her side, then quickly levered the Winchester and pointed it back at John MacRae. Molly regretted telling John MacRae that Jacob Stone was drunk. She said, "I'm sorry, Johnny," as she fell to the floor, bleeding profusely from the wound in her side. John MacRae ignored the Winchester pointed at him and rushed to Molly's side. He cradled her head in his arms and said, "Please don't die on me." Molly smiled and lapsed into unconsciousness. Jacob Stone laughed and said, "Well, look who's got a thing for the whore. Take your last look at her, you meddling son of a bitch." George Stone had silently watched everything that happened. He finally stood and said, "What are you going to do, son?" Jacob Stone laughed and said, "What do you think? I'm going to kill them both. You can help me bury them in the woods back behind the corral." George Stone shook his head and said, "When is all of this going to stop, Jacob?" Jacob Stone gave his father a menacing look and said, "When I say it's going to stop, old man." John MacRae knew what Jacob Stone was planning to do. He desperately tried to think of a way to save himself and Molly. John MacRae had noticed that George Stone put a revolver into his pocket. He wondered how he could handle both of the Stones. John MacRae slowly tried to lower his hand and be in a position to draw the Colt out of the holster. Jacob Stone noticed what John MacRae was attempting to do and said, "No, you don't. Put those hands in the air." John MacRae was about to speak when George Stone said, "This all has to stop, son. Let them go." Jacob Stone pointed a Winchester at his father and said, "Do you want some of this, old man? You know, I can always say that MacRae shot you before I killed him. You know, that's not a bad idea. I won't have to wait until you croak to get it all." "You evil bastard," said George Stone, shaking his fist at his son. John MacRae saw the Winchester being pointed at George Stone and reached for his Colt. Out of the corner of his eye, Jacob Stone saw John MacRae reaching for his Colt. He quickly swung the Winchester around and pointed it at John MacRae. Before he could pull the trigger, pistol shots rang out. George Stone fired 2 shots at Jacob Stone with the Smith & Wesson revolver he had retrieved from his pocket. The first shot hit Jacob Stone in the neck. The second shot entered the base of his skull. Jacob Stone was dead before he hit the ground. George Stone threw the revolver into a corner and sat down. He buried his face in his hands and said, "It's finally over." John MacRae could not believe what he had just witnessed, and he stared in amazement. He holstered his Colt and said, "What now, Major?" George Stone said, "MacRae, I've done White Eagle and a lot of other people terrible wrongs. I used my influence to cover up for my son's misdeeds many times. I always thought that this was my duty as a father. I hoped that someday maybe he would straighten out. Things just got worse. Your Indian friend is innocent. Jacob killed his own wife in a fit of rage. I didn't see him do it, but I know he killed her. He told me before the trial that he had come home early. He was hiding in the barn and he heard everything his wife said to Eagleton. He killed her after Eagleton left. Then he went into town and planted the bloody knife in White Eagle's saddlebag. I testified falsely and probably would have let the Indian hang if you had not come around. Jacob's pointing that rifle at me and threatening to kill me was something I could not abide. I will go into town with you and testify to what really happened." John MacRae said, "I don't know what to say, Major, but thank you." "I'm not a major anymore, MacRae," said George Stone sarcastically. George Stone then walked over to Molly. He inspected her wound and he said, "She will die if we don't get her to a doctor. There's a doctor who lives a few miles from here. I've done a few favors for him. He will help her. It's further away from town, but we should have enough time to save the Indian. I hear he's scheduled to hang at noon tomorrow." Some of George Stone's ranch hands had woken up after hearing the shots and commotion. George Stone told them what had happened and asked them to hitch up a buckboard. At George Stone's request, they placed Jacob Stone's lifeless body into the buckboard. They also placed Molly in the buckboard and covered her with several blankets. George Stone drove the buckboard out to the doctor's home. John MacRae followed him on Mac. They had to go slow because of Molly, and it took almost an hour to arrive at the doctor's home. George Stone woke Dr. Davis up and told him what happened. Dr. Davis almost never treated patients in his home. He told John MacRae and George Stone to carry Molly in and place her on a table in the dining room. After examining Molly, Dr. Davis said, "She has lost a lot of blood, but I think I can save her. I'll tell you this, she would have not lasted much longer. The wound did not do any damage to her vitals, but the loss of blood would have killed her. There's some whiskey in the cabinet over there. Help yourselves." John MacRae and George Stone each had a few glasses of whiskey in the parlor, while Dr. Davis treated Molly. They said nothing to each other. They both dozed intermittently until dawn. Dr. Davis entered the parlor. His white apron had blood on it. George Stone woke up. John MacRae was already awake. Dr. Davis said, "Molly will live, but it's best if she stays here for at least a week or so. I don't want her moving around much and have the bleeding start again. My wife can take care of her." John MacRae looked at his pocket watch, then at George Stone. He said, "It's 6 a.m. White Eagle is scheduled to hang at noon. We better get going. Are you sure you are going to do this, Major?" George Stone put his coat on and said yes. The city marshal approached his cell and said, "The mayor and the city fathers want your execution moved up. You will hang at 8 a.m. today. Don't ask me why. They would not give me a reason. I think it might have something to do with your being an Indian. Do you want anything to eat?" No, I don't. Why don't you open up my cell? I'll run out and you can shoot me. You can say I was trying to escape. No one will doubt your word. I don't want to die by the rope," said White Eagle. "You will hang, that's for darn sure," said the city marshal as he left the cell area. White Eagle sat down on his pallet and buried his face in his hands. John MacRae tied Mac to the back of the buckboard and sat on the buckboard seat with George Stone. They said nothing to each other except for John MacRae asking George Stone how long the trip to town would take. It was a 2-hour trip. As they rode into Deadwood, John MacRae and George Stone noticed a large crowd had gathered at the far end of town. White Eagle was handcuffed and taken from his cell. He was placed in a small open wagon and driven to the gallows on the edge of town. A large crowd had gathered to watch the execution. The wagon stopped at the gallows, and White Eagle was helped out of the wagon. The crowd was strangely quiet. Many in the crowd were wondering why the Stones were not here to witness the execution. The city marshal and his deputy were on either side of White Eagle as he walked up the 13 steps. They led him over to a trapdoor and placed him in the middle of it. The deputy used leather straps with silver buckles to bind White Eagle's arms and feet. The city marshal read the death warrant. He looked at White Eagle and said, "Do you have any last words?" White Eagle looked to the sky and quietly said no. The city marshal placed the noose around White Eagle's neck and adjusted it. He placed a black hood over White Eagle's head. The deputy grasped the lever that would spring the trapdoor and send White Eagle into eternity. He looked at the marshal and waited his signal. The city marshal was just about to nod his head when a loud, familiar voice rang out and said, "Stop." It was George Stone. He stepped out of the buckboard and walked over to the gallows. George Stone looked at the city marshal and said, "This execution must stop." The city marshal looked puzzled and said, "Why, George, isn't this the son of a bitch that murdered your son's wife?" George Stone said, "The Indian is innocent. My son murdered his own wife. He is lying dead in that wagon over there." George Stone proceeded to tell the city marshal what had really happened and the events that transpired in the past few days. The city marshal removed the hood and noose from White Eagle's head and neck. He said, "Take him back to the jail until we talk to Judge Wilkins. George, if it were anybody but you, I would have not have stopped that hanging." Later that day, John MacRae, George Stone, and the city marshal met with Judge Wilkins. White Eagle was cleared of all charges and released. No charges were filed against George Stone. No words were ever spoken again between George Stone and John MacRae. George Stone returned to his ranch, and that afternoon he put a bullet in his head using the .45 Colt revolver he carried during his days as a cavalry officer. The next day, John MacRae reported to the Homestake Gold Mine in Leeds, South Dakota, to begin his career as the paymaster. John Eagleton reopened his general store. John MacRae stopped by John Eagleton's general store to see how White Eagle was getting along. White Eagle remarked that business was back to normal, and in fact, better than before. He thanked John MacRae for saving his life and asked if there was anything he could do for him. John MacRae said, "Do you have any of those fancy suits you wear for sale?" "Why, do you need one to wear in your job?" "I don't have any for sale. I order mine from out east. I'd give you one of mine, but it wouldn't fit you at all," said White Eagle. "I just want one for a special occasion," said John MacRae. White Eagle smiled and said, "I do have a brand new frock coat that I ordered for a customer who got too fat for it. It should fit you perfectly, and I'm sure it'll match the occasion just fine." Later that day, John MacRae knocked on Molly's door. She opened the door slowly and saw John MacRae standing there. He was wearing a dark herringbone frock coat with a white shirt and sporting a red puff tie. He handed Molly a bouquet of daffodils and said, "Will you dine with me tonight, Duchess?" Molly started crying and she said, "You know who I am and what I was. Why would you even want to be seen with me? I'm just, Before Molly could finish her reply, John MacRae put his arms around Molly and gently put a hand over her mouth. He wiped the tears from her eyes and said, "Shush, my dear. I just see a pretty woman who did what she had to do to survive." He smiled and said, Besides, I finally found a woman who can cook to suit my taste. Molly smiled and kissed John MacRae. She said, "Why don't we dine right here? I'll cook you another beefsteak, Johnny." On June 24th, 1891, the Molly MacRae dress shop had its grand opening in Deadwood.